Hello everyone, welcome to this live stream that is brought to you by CAT by LPT. Guys, we are running this tough enough question series where we pick up these questions from VARC section and we practice these questions so that it helps you understand how these questions are solved, and it is also a very perfect medium for you to practice. So what we are basically going to do is we are going to practice some questions of odd one out. Now remember last year, as I'm sure for those of you who have taken it last year, you already know that since last 2-3 years we have been witnessing odd one out questions in that. There were 2 questions last year, so it is pretty much expected that this year also you may or may not have a question of odd one out. So let us practice some questions and try to understand how do we go about solving these questions. Now, as far as solving odd one out is concerned, guys, understand one thing. I'm sure that each one of you knows how these questions are solved, what are the do's and what are the don'ts. And you pretty much also understand the fact that what is the accuracy level that you can achieve as far as these questions are concerned. So let us not waste any more time. Let us quickly get started with the first question itself. Now, these questions are moderate to difficult. I have not kept the level from easy to moderate because that is pretty much doable. But when you practice these questions, remember it's somewhere in the range of moderate to difficult, and that is what we are trying to practice. Also understand, as far as odd one out is concerned, you can go by whichever method you want to use as far as solving these questions are concerned. So some of you, when you solve these questions, you figure out the sequences and then you figure out which one does not belong to the sequence that becomes as an answer. And for some question, it is absolutely possible that you read the 5 sentences and on reading statements, you figure out that this one is the statement which does not gel with the rest of the paragraph. So whichever way you are doing it, it is just that you have to get accurate answers. It does not really matter what is the approach that you are following there. So let us get started with the first question itself. Here is the question for you guys. So first question of odd one out, do it the way you do it, and then we will have a quick discussion. First question on your screen. Welcome everyone for the session, and I hope you are solving this question. We start discussing how do we approach the answer. All right, guys. So I hope you would have an answer by now because these questions are not very difficult to answer. So it's moderate to difficult. That is the level we are practicing here. So whichever way you want to do it. So whether you want to arrange these sentences into the sequence or you want to read and understand the context of the passage, whichever way you do it, it's absolutely okay. Let's try about solving this question. So let's first read the sentences and see, guys. Understand one thing: when you understand odd one out, please know that when you talk about an odd one out questions, it says each question consists of 5 sentences. 4 of them can be arranged to form a coherent and meaningful paragraph. So out of these 5 sentences, you can arrange 4 of them into a certain sequence, and one that does not belong to the sequence is the answer we are looking for. So basically, I always tell students that it's better to form a sequence to have an accuracy in the question, but whichever way you are doing it, whether it is by forming a sequence or by just simply reading the sentences together, completely okay, whichever way you want to do it. So let's try to understand this question. It says, over the last decade, behavioral economists have challenged the notion that humans consistently act in their own national self-interest. So we have a sentence that gives you some information. Let's read out the sentences again. It says B, a series of experiment has revealed predictable cognitive biases that shape everyday decision making. Okay. Now, if you have these two sentences, I'm sure you would have figured it out which one forms a better opening statement. Let's go further. It says classical thermodynamics clearly assume that particles behave independently unless external forces intervene. Okay, so one more information that is given to you. He says these findings. Now look at this. These findings, you have a pronoun, have encouraged policymakers to reconsider the design of public choice architectures. Okay, and he says as a result, nudges that subtly alter choices are now widely used in taxation, health, and environmental policy. So when you have these five sentences, it's always better to go through a sequence. If you look at these five sentences, this cannot start because it is somewhere in the discussion that is ongoing. Now, this talks about thermodynamics, talks about behavioral economists have challenged the notion that humans consistently act in their own national self-interest. So, of course, if you compare these sentences, you understand that the opening sentence has to be A. So, out of these statements, A is the sentence that starts. Now, it says B. Now, this is substantiated by B. It says a series of experiments has revealed predictable cognitive biases that shape everyday decision making. So, this is again continuing with the idea of what behavioral economists have challenged as an idea. So I'm sure that you have a pair that is A and B that goes together. Now this talks about revealing something, and then you have D, says these findings have encouraged policymakers to reconsider the design of public choice architecture, and then you conclude by saying, so A, B forms a sequence, and then you conclude by E saying, as a result, nudges that subtly alter choices are now widely used in taxation, health, environmental policy. On the other hand, if you look at this sentence that is E, it talks about classical thermodynamics similarly assumes that particles behave independently unless external forces intervene. So, this is the sentence that does not gel with the rest of the four sentences. So A, B is the sequence that we were looking at, and the odd one out is sentence number C that answers our question. Okay, so that's how you pretty much go about answering questions. Now, guys, as I told you earlier as well, whichever method you want to use, whichever gives you a greater accuracy, that is what you should be preferring. Although, when you talk about solving odd one out question, the question is easy, moderate. It's very obvious that you will be able to figure out the odd one out on simply reading. At other times, you will have to necessarily go for forming the sequence of the sentence. So, the first question is done. Let's go to the second question now. Yeah, so you have the second question here. Try doing that. Second question on your screen, trying to figure out which is the sentence that does not belong to the rest four. All right, so that was the second question. Let's figure out how do we arrive at the answer. So let's quickly read the sentences and try to get a hint of what these sentences are talking about. And one that does not belong to the group is the answer. It says modern museums increasingly recognize their responsibility to reflect the diversity of the community they serve. Okay, so responsibility to reflect the diversity of the community they serve. B says many institutions now employ outreach to collaborate with neighborhood on exhibitions. Now, this again takes the idea further. He says this has led to a notable decline in visitor numbers across major metropolitan museums. Okay, so this is also related to the theme, but let's look at the other sentences also. So D says the goal is to dismantle the elitist perception of museums as remote cultural fortresses. And E says such efforts have also resulted in collections that are more representative and so. So if you look at these sentences, if you can just figure it out from the all the context here, that most probably it is a the statement that starts. So it says modern music increasingly recognize their responsibility to reflect the diversity of the community they serve. So it gives you an agenda, it gives you a topic of discussion here. Now B says many institutions now employ outreach to collaborate with neighborhood groups on exhibitions. Now, this also talks about museums and exhibitions. So again, takes it further, right? He says this has led to a noticeable decline in visitor numbers across major metropolitan museums. Now, this sentence talks about something not related in the previous two sentences, because talks about decline in visitor numbers. So we have not really talked about the number visited with respect to the museums. He says the goal is to dismantle the elitist perception of museums as remote cultural fortresses. So this again gels with statement number 1 and statement number 2. So D again goes to the same theme, and it says such efforts have also resulted in collections that are more representative and socially. So it talks about diversity of the communities they serve. Then it talks about neighborhood groups on exhibitions. Again, with the same thing, we carry on with the goal is to dismantle the elitist perception of museums as remote cultural fortresses, and forms a pair. And then, of course, you have D and E. Says such efforts have also resulted in collections that are more representative and social age. You have A and B coming together. Along with it, have D and E, which deals with the entire idea of being discussed in the paragraph. Now, if you look at this statement, on the other hand, this statement talks about noticeable decline in visitor numbers in the metropolitan museums. Now, though it talks about museums, the focus is not on the decline in the numbers of the visitors. So C comes the odd one out. So basically what we are trying to figure out with these questions is, these questions, they have got a common theme, they have got a common idea that is being talked about. One that does not belong to that group becomes our answer. That was the second question. Let's go to the third question now. Here is the third question. Third question on your screen. Try answering this question based upon your understanding of the text and the sentence. All right, I think you would have got your answer by now. Let's evaluate this question and try to figure out which is the sentence that does not belong to the rest of the four statements. Now, A says historically, sea trade routes dictated the rise and fall of medieval port cities. Okay, so this gives us a topic of discussion. B says these cities, and we have talked about port cities as well. Now, these cities invested heavily in maritime defense to protect monopoly on spice and silk. Okay, so we did find a common ground here. Let's look at C sentence. It says the role of digital currency reshaping global financial networks remains contested. So we are talking about sea trade here, okay, and dictating the rise and fall of the medieval port city. We continued with the idea by saying invested heavily in maritime defense monopolies on spice and silk. Now, if you look at the C sentence, this talks about the role of digital currencies in reshaping global financial network remains contested. Now, this is a point that is completely at deviances with the rest of the two statements. So, most likely our answer, but let's just aside. Then D says the shifting winds of commerce often redirected fortunes overnight. Okay, so we talked about rise and fall of medieval port cities, and we talked about the shift winds of commerce often redirected fortunes overnight. And E says naval alliances were frequently forged to secure stable trade positions. So, if you have read these 5 sentences, I'm sure कुछ लोगों को समझ में इस तरीके से भी आ गया होगा कि यहाँ पे जो स्टेटमेंट नंबर सी है talks about digital currencies shaping global financial networks remain contested. And in the remaining 4 sentences, we have not talked about anything like this. Okay. Even if we don't go by the sequence of the sentences, we will still be able to figure out that most likely statement number C has to be the odd one out. But just to make a clarity, just to make sure that our answers are on the correct line, let's figure out what would be the sequence of the rest of the 4 statements. Of course, to start with A, historically sea trade routes dictated the rise and fall of medieval port city. Then you say the shifting winds of commerce talks about trade routes often redirected fortunes overnight. So you have A and D. And then you continue by saying these cities invested heavily in maritime defense systems to protect monopolies on spice and silk. And then you have E, so it is that forms the sequence in order to answer this question. So to look at the entire way this particular question has been framed, statement number C that talks about digital currencies, which does not correlate with the rest of the sentences, and that makes our answer as. That was the third question. Just read it through, just check it through if you're able to figure out the correct answer there. Okay, I think we are good to go for the next question, question number 4. Yes. All right, that was enough of a time to solve an odd one out question. Let's now try to figure out the answer. So let's read out the sentences. It says, over the counter supplements are often marketed as natural alternatives to pharmaceutical drugs. So this talks about over the counter supplements marketed as natural alternatives to pharmaceutical drugs. B says, yet clinical data suggests that many supplements lack rigorous evidence supporting their claimed benefits. Okay, so this also talks about supplement. C says regulatory agencies worldwide share a uniform framework for approving herbal products. All right. D says as a result, consumers often rely on testimonials rather than validated scientific research. And E says this gap in regulation has allowed aggressive marketing to flourish. So have these four or five sentences here, and if you look at the content of these statements, it talks about supplement. This also talks about supplement. Now here it talks about clinical data suggests that many supplements lack rigorous evidence supporting their claimed benefits. So of course A and B do have a common idea on which the author is making a discussion. Now C talks about regulatory agencies worldwide share a uniform framework for approving herbal products. So C is the statement that is talking about herbal products. So not really dealing with the previous two statements. So yeah, keep it aside. He says, as a result, consumers often rely on testimonials rather than validated scientific research. Now this goes with statement number B, where it says that clinical data suggests that many supplements lack rigorous evidence. And then you talk about this gap in regulation has allowed aggressive marketing. So and it forms the sequence of sentences that we are looking for. And out of these sentences, this C talks about the herbal products. That is the odd one out of the remaining. That's what we have here. This is the sequence, and C the odd one. Guys, also understand that when you solve an odd one out question, although it is always a safer way that you figure out the sequence of the sentence and then proceed the one that does not fit into that sequence as your correct answer, but sometimes it is always better to give it a benefit of doubt. And if you're able to read these sentences, understand the context, and figure out the common theme, and one that does not belong to that theme comes your answer. So even that approach helps. So whichever way you want to do it, depending upon how much can you analyze and predict the difficulty level of the question, both of the ways can be taken as the correct alternatives to solving these. Chalo, I think we can go for the next question now. Question number 5 on your screen. All right, seems like a easy to moderate question, so does not really fall into the category of moderate to difficult. This was easy to moderate. Let's try to understand how do we figure out the odd sentence here. So A says urban planners increasingly emphasize the importance of pedestrian friendly public spaces. So it talks about urban planners having an emphasis on the importance of pedestrian friendly public spaces. B says well designed sidewalks and plazas dramatically improve the quality of social interactions. Okay, so this gives you an effect of emphasis or importance of pedestrian friendly public spaces. He says these measures have also reduced the dependence on political lobbying within city council. All right, so there is an element of political councils coming over here, which is not related to the previous two sentences. Let's look at D. Inclusive design principles focus on accessibility, safety, and environmental sustainability. Now, again, this is the statement that talks along the same lines, which is pedestrian friendly public spaces. And E says, cities that adopt these principles, accessibility, safety, and environmental sustainability, report higher levels of citizen satisfaction. So, for those of you who have read these sentences and have understood it correctly, I hope that you would have understood that we would go by the sequence, that is A. Okay, so it starts there, then you have D, and then you have B, and making C as the odd one out. So this is the sequence that we were looking for. So A, B, and E follows the same kind of principle that we started off with in the first sentence, continues the direction and discussion in the same place, and then have C, which shifts from this because it talks about these measures have also reduced the dependence on political lobbying within city council. So this really does not gel with the rest of the four statements, making C as the odd one. All right, let's go to the next question, question number 6. Sorry. Sixth question on your screen. Try figuring it out. All right, so let's go about solving this question of odd one out and try to figure out which is the sentence that does not really belong to the rest of the four statements, or it does not cater to the theme that is discussed in the other statements. A says the early romantic poets were deeply suspicious of the industrial transformation across Britain. So we talk about romantic poets here being of industrial transformation sweeping across Britain. All right. B says their work celebrated untamed landscapes as a sanctuary from mechanized urban life. Okay. If you look at this there represents romantic poets. Of course, this goes along the same line. It says celebrated untamed landscape as a sanctuary from mechanized urban life. All right. He says, in contrast, many Enlightenment thinkers embraced industrial progress as proof of human. Now, this talks about a contradictory point. It talks about contrast. Many Enlightenment thinkers embrace industrial progress as a proof of human reason. All right. He says the romantic emphasis. So, this talks about the romantic poets per se. So, the romantic emphasis on emotional authenticity often clashed with rationalist doctrine, and he says advances in textile engineering accelerated factory production across northern England. So once you have read these 5 statements, I'm sure you would have figured it out that we do have a common theme here, and that is romantic poets being suspicious of the industrial transformation across Britain. Then you have A is the statement that starts or introduces the discussion here. B says their work celebrated untamed landscapes as a site from mechanized urban life. So this gives their viewpoint here. So A and B goes together. Now you continue along the same line with respect to romantic poets, and then you say the romantic emphasis on emotional authenticity often clashed with rationalist doctrine, and then you conclude by C. So A and C. So C, in contrast, many Enlightenment thinkers embrace industrial progress as a proof of human reason. Now E, on the other hand, talks about textile engineering accelerator factory production across northern England. So that really does not gel with the rest of the statements here, making as the odd one out. E becomes the answer. All right, let's go to the next question, question number 7. Okay, I think we can handle this question going by the same way we have solved the other questions. The performer remains the same. It says overfishing has severely disrupted the reproductive cycle. So it talks about overfishing has disrupted the reproductive cycles of several large marine species. So we have an agenda in a site. He says marine biologists have proposed time area closure to allow ecosystems to recover. So this gives you a kind of a solution to the problem that is being discussed. He says advances in telescopes have revolutionized our understanding of stellar evolution. Now, if you look at this C statement, you read it and you comprehend, you understand that it talks about space telescopes, and the understanding of stellar evolution does not relate with the other two statements. So most precisely, we have figured out our odd sentence out. Let's look at D and E as well. Declining fish stocks threaten the livelihoods of coastal communities worldwide. So this again goes with the case of overfishing. And E says regional treaties now attempt to regulate fishing pressure open water zones. Now, if you have read the 5 sentences together, you would understand that statement number A, yes, D and E, they follow the same pattern of discussion, that is overfishing. On the other hand, C talks about advances in space-based telescopes and understanding of stellar evolution, making this as the odd one outside. So C is the answer. And if you look at the sequence here, so it is A followed by D followed by B. So that is the sequence that you are looking for. So C is the odd one out. Alright guys, we can go to the next question now. Question number 8. Try to come up with an answer guys before we start discussing this question further. All right, we are good to go because the time taken to solve, the average time taken to solve a single odd one out question should never exceed, because you have to keep track of your time. So when you talk about the VARC section, you have to manage your time between RCs also and between also. So considering the fact that you probably would not be doing all the questions of VA, maximum time that you can give to one question of VA is about 1 to 1.5 minutes. Maximum it can go up to 2 minutes, but not beyond. So let's read out these sentences and try to understand what it has to say. It says effective leadership often requires the ability to navigate competing trust within a team. B says leaders who cultivate psychological safety tend to foster more innovation. All right. C says neuroscientists recently discovered new protein structures the hippocampus. He says encouraging open dialogue allows team members to challenge assumptions without fear. And he says studies show that trust-based environments correlate strongly with performance. So when you read these 5 sentences, I hope that you by now would have figured out that there is one sentence which does not really blend with the other 4 sentences. Try to read it before I tell you the answer. Right. So if you look at these five sentences here, let's look at C1. What does it say? It says neuroscientists recently discovered new protein structures in the hippocampus. So even if you don't arrange the statements into the sequence, you understand that statement A and E and E, they follow the same sort of discussion that is going on in the rest of the sentences. On the other hand, C talks about neuroscientists discovering new protein structures in the hippocampus. So that does not really relate to the other four sentences, making C as the odd one out statement. So that's the answer that we were looking for. Right, let's go to the next question, question number 9. The second last question before we move to the last one and wind up this session. All right, so let's try to decode this question. A says the revival of vinyl records illustrates how nostalgia can influence purchase decisions. So it talks about revival of vinyl records, illustrates how nostalgia can influence purchasing decisions. All right. B says limited edition often sell out within hours of release. All right. Advances in laser cutting technology have improved the precision of vinyl pressing. And D says many collectors cite the tactile experience of analog sound as irreplaceable. And E says streaming platforms now dominate the global music market. So, out these statements, you will understand that even if you have not figured out the correct sequence for the rest of the other statements, now A, B, and so if you have here, so of course it will start with A. Then it says illustrates how nostalgia influence purchase decisions. Continue the same process and say many collectors cite the tactile experience of analog sound as irreplaceable. Now this is one thing that is related to statement number A. Now it says limited edition release often sell out within hours of release. Advances in laser cutting technology have improved the precision of vinyl pressing. So A, D, and C the sequence that we are looking for, and E the statement that does not really delve with the rest of the other statements, making is the odd one out. That's how we answer this question. So ADBC the sequence and E the statement that does not belong to the group. All right. That brings us to the last question of discussion, question number 10. Before we continue with the rest of the sessions. All right, guys, that's the last question for us to practice as far as odd one out is concerned. So let's read out the sentences, try to understand what theme is being talked about, try to relate the sentences and figure out which does not belong to the group. So A says contemporary climate models increasingly incorporate feedback loop from melting permafrost. B says these loops release methane, a potent greenhouse gas that accelerates warming. C says some oceanographers argue that medieval trade influenced monsoon variability. D says updated models predict faster than expected temperature rises, polar. All right, so faster than expected temperature rises gels with accelerated warming. He says the complexity of these interactions makes long-term projections challenging. Okay, so if you look at these 5 sentences here, I'm sure you would have figured it out that it is the A statement that we start with. So it says climate models increase corporate feedback loop, and then you continue statement. It says these loops release a potent greenhouse gas that accelerates warming. Then you have updated models predict faster than expected temperature rises that along correlates with the accelerated warming. So A, B goes together, and E says the complexity of these interactions, long-term projections, challenging. E comes here, and then you have which does not gel with the rest of the statement. It talks about oceanographers argue that medieval trade winds influenced monsoon variability. It does not really relate to the climate change models that we're discussing in the rest of the statement. So making C as the correct answer. All right, guys. So those were the 10 questions of odd one out that we have practiced. For somebody who is already, aware of everything that we have discussed. So we discussed how these questions are supposed to be solved. We have practiced a few questions as well. And it gives you a better kind of a confidence that you will be able to deal with questions in examination. So just keep practicing as much as you can. Just make sure that you revise the concepts, the do's and don'ts of the VA section and the RC section, and you are good to go. So that was all from my side. Keep practicing harder, keep working harder, and I'm sure you will need the examination that you're targeting. All the best. Thank you so much.